love it when Jesus messes with us. Do you know what I mean? Here's my confession, is that I get fed up with Christians a lot. Sometimes I get bored by worship. I'm kind of over theological debate. I have very little use for institutional religious posturing. Sometimes I even get tired of Scripture. But I never get tired of Jesus. He's just so smart. He's kind of wily. Have you ever noticed that? He's always unexpected, forcing me to reevaluate what I thought I knew about him and what I thought I knew about myself. I love it when Jesus messes with us, which is what he's doing in the scripture passage we heard this morning. I bet you've heard this story before. Two men go up to the temple to pray, a Pharisee and a tax collector. And immediately, we have some assumptions about what's going to go down in this story. Because we know who Pharisees are, right? Religious leaders, the local pastors of their day, dudes who follow the Torah and lead other people to faithfulness. And so Jesus' first listeners would have known immediately. They would have had warm feelings about the Pharisee in this story. He was their beloved pastor, an example of piety, a good guy who did all the right things. And indeed, that's how the story goes. The Pharisee goes up to the temple and begins to pray and says, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, even that tax collector over there. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of all my income. And then there's the tax collector. And the crowds listening to Jesus would have had some immediate ideas about that guy, too. He was an agent of the empire, someone working in a profession known to be filled with sellouts, people who cast their allegiance with the Romans instead of with their people, who ended up rich and protected, but were also probably mourning their integrity and identity. And the tax collector in this story also lives up to the stereotypes. He goes to the temple and beats his breast and prays, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And Jesus tells us this simple story that appears on every count to conform to his hearers' assumptions about who is good and who is not, who's righteous and who's a rogue, who's justified and who deserves punishment. And then Jesus says, I tell you, the tax collector went down to his home justified rather than the Pharisee. Let's put a pin in that story, especially the preposition rather than. We're going to come back to it. Who gets justified? Who is righteous? Last year, I moved back to my hometown of Roanoke, Virginia, but before that, I lived for about a decade down the road in Durham, in North Carolina. Maybe some of you all know Durham a little bit. It is a fascinating place. And living there changed me in a lot of ways. One of my favorite Durham stories is about the HEART program. Anybody heard of the HEART program in Durham? Oh, I get to tell you this story for the first time. In Durham, for years, folks were working and organizing and advocating to shift safety and wellness practices out of the police department and into the hands of the community. And in 2019, that coalition won their campaign to establish a city office of community safety. In 2021, the city shifted funding from 5 unfilled police officer roles and $1 million from the city budget to begin a pilot program. And in June of 2022, the city deployed its first HEART teams, holistic, empathetic assistance response teams, unarmed teams of licensed mental health clinicians, peer support, and EMTs to divert 911 calls away from an armed police response. So in Durham, if a 911 call comes through the dispatch that's about a mental health crisis, trespassing, a welfare check, an intoxicated person, panhandling, prostitution, nuisance, public indecency, or a lost person, where there's not a gun involved, HEART goes to the scene instead of or alongside armed police officers. If you want to know more, the Department of Community Safety in Durham publishes an intense dashboard of statistics that tracks literally everything you can think of about their work to offer transparency and education. And in the last 3 years, HEART has mounted nearly 30,000 responses in the community. Responders on the HEART teams reported feeling safe in 99% of those situations. And the percentage of times that HEART teams had to call for armed police backup, 0.03%. HEART, by every measure, is incredibly successful at caring for neighbors in Durham. But not everybody in Durham believed that would be the case. Durham isn't just a progressive city, it's actually kind of radical. And the police department in Durham is not exactly beloved. In some places, not even really respected all that much. Maybe you remember this movement to defund the police back in 2020. In Durham, community organizers painted a gigantic mural on the public street in front of the brand new police station that said defund with an arrow pointing at the building. That mural stayed an entire year because so many people were in support of it. In Durham, lots of people are skeptical of the police. And on the other side of the equation, the entire budget for this brand new experimental Department of Community Safety came from unfilled police positions. The police department themselves were not exactly happy about having their budget stolen for a new, untested, feel-good experiment. No one knew if this was going to work or not. Soon after the trial period of the HEART program ended, I got to attend a debut of a documentary film where there was a panel with the director of the Department of Community Safety and the chief of police and police officers and staff from the new department who were talking about their work together. They talked about how exactly they were able to find common ground and make the HEART program a success. And in that conversation, the police chief affirmed to us her officers were not excited about this new experiment. And the director of community safety said, yeah, my staff didn't really know how it would go either. There was tension, maybe even some contempt. But the story that the police chief and the director of community safety told that evening involved a lot of surprise and a lot of humility. Because of limited resources, the HEART teams had to be on the same radio communications channel as police officers who were out on patrol, which meant that every time a call came in and HEART responded, the on-duty police officers heard, step by step, play by play, how the new folks responded to these crises. And after months, the police chief said, her officers started to come around. They liked what they heard over the radio. They started to respect the HEART responders. Sometimes they even started showing up to a 911 call, radioing back to dispatch and say, you don't need us here, send the HEART team. And so a minivan filled with people in teal t-shirts rolled up, changed the situation. I suspect hearts were changed on both sides of that equation. Police officers learned to trust HEART responders. HEART responders and those of us who are skeptical of police learned to respect the police officers. And HEART would not exist without this kind of radical cooperation. The Community Safety Department simply couldn't exist without cooperation from the police, and the police department, given the state of politics and the budget and feeling in Durham, might not exist if they hadn't figured out how to work with HEART. I am so glad, aren't you, that we humans are created with the capacity to change, that our opinions are not set in stone, that our hearts are malleable enough to soften and expand. Some of you might know that 2 years ago, the Church of the Brethren removed my ordination because I officiated the wedding of 2 precious young adult women in my congregation. The process and result were painful for me because in addition to my work in the local church, I was also a leader in the denomination, working around the country and serving as the main writer for the polity that the district board used to remove my ordination. The people on the board who voted to remove my ordination were mostly folks who had known me a long time. Some of them knew me my whole life. People I didn't expect to take such a hard line or inflict such pain on me and so many other beloved siblings. But that experience has helped me to articulate what has been the most difficult spiritual challenge of my life. Maybe some of you can relate. How to separate people, precious, beloved, flawed, curious, interesting, eccentric, doing their best human beings, from the systems of oppression in which we are all forced to live and move and attempt to have good lives. Systems are really, really bad at things like love and grace and nuance and intuition and humor and compassion. They put us into categories and treat us like cogs. Systems encourage us to classify living, breathing human beings as either good or bad, based on where they've found themselves located within any given institution or community. Systems are black and white, good and evil, yes or no. They're tools for making clear distinctions and snap judgments. People, on the other hand, are precious. We are complicated, nuanced, illogical, surprising, and always, always, always in process. The most difficult challenge spiritually of my life has been choosing to love people as those precious, nuanced, struggling beings we are, while directing my immense, admittedly, anger, frustration, rage, and disappointment at the systems and structures that try to keep us from recognizing one another's humanity. It is not easy. It might, in fact, be impossible. But Jesus keeps showing up and messing with me and inviting us to try it. So back to the parable. Back to Jesus messing with all of us. For Jesus' first hearers, the setup is clear. Pharisees are good, tax collectors are bad. So when he says there at the end that the tax collector went home justified rather than the Pharisee, we see what he's doing. Humility is better than self-righteousness. Got it, Jesus. Check. But if you've read Luke's gospel a time or two, we might have a different perspective. We're ready for that reversal because we know that in Luke's gospel, the Pharisees actually are kind of not great. Religious leaders disappoint Jesus over and over and over, and in Luke's gospel, the tax collectors end up being the ethical example. We're ready, if we've read Luke's gospel, to direct our contempt toward the self-righteous Pharisee from the get-go. So when Jesus says that the tax collector went home justified rather than the Pharisee, we feel validated. I do. That's right. Those religious leaders are so stuck up they can't even manage to see their own self-righteousness. Contemptible. And suddenly, I am right back in the trap that Jesus has set. You remember how Luke introduces the story? He says, Jesus told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves a bit too much and felt contempt for others. And when I read the parable, feel validated in my own views, and sense that contempt rising for the Pharisee and all the contemptible religious leaders of our own day, I'm right back in the snare. Who's worthy of my contempt? How do I draw the line? Who's good and who's bad? Who's right and who's wrong? Who deserves mercy and who doesn't? And here's where the parable gets fun. We're going to do some Greek grammar, so hold on to your hats. The line at the end of this parable is translated in most Bibles as the tax collector went home justified rather than the Pharisee. But the Greek preposition, are you still with me? Greek grammar, fun stuff on a Sunday morning. The Greek preposition in that sentence is para. You know that one? It could mean rather than, but it's a versatile preposition. It could also mean alongside, like in the words parable or parallel or paraclete. That line that Jesus says at the end of his story might actually read, the tax collector went down to his home justified alongside the Pharisee. Maybe God's mercy is big enough to encompass not only the ones we think are good or righteous or worthy of following, but also those we assume not to be, those we assume to be our enemies, those that we assume to be worthy of our contempt. I know there's a face flashing through your mind right now. Worthy of your contempt. I bet I can guess who some of them are. But get this, we're not done with the preposition because it is so versatile that it might also be translated as because of. As in, the tax collector went down to his home justified because of the Pharisee. But Jesus doesn't use names, he just says that man. So it might be the Pharisee went down to his home justified because of the tax collector. Maybe God's mercy expects and requires our own mercy. Maybe our own righteousness depends on assuming the righteousness of others, even, especially, the ones we're prepared to find contemptible. I see that face flashing in your head. Maybe our justification is bound up in the justification of our neighbors, both the ones we really like a lot and the ones we absolutely cannot stand. It's one of the most difficult spiritual practices of my life to believe this and to act as if it were true. I'm constantly on the lookout for people who have figured it out and are trying to live its truth, like the people in Durham who found a way to make that heart program work despite their misgivings, their distrust, their contempt. Luke adds a little postscript to the parable. All who exalt themselves, he says, will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. What if we stopped aiming at exaltation altogether? What if we tried instead to simply see each other as the precious, beloved, complicated, doing our best, stuck in horrific systems, flawed and phenomenal beings that we all, each and every one of us, are created to be? This is not easy work. It is, in fact, exceptionally difficult to put aside our contempt and choose curiosity and compassion instead. But it is also, I'm convicted, the very thing that Jesus is asking us to do. And I think the very thing that our chaotic world is in desperate need of here and now. I'm going to try. Will you join me?